Today we are reflecting on Martin Luther King's March on Washington and his inspirational I Have a Dream speech, drawing both from his speech and David Levering Lewis's biography of Martin Luther King. And we reflect on these questions. Why was his I Have a Dream speech so memorable, so inspiring, and what was its historical context? How did it respond to violence and bombings often faced by those seeking civil rights and justice for all citizens? Did the March on Washington encourage the passage of the upcoming Civil Rights Act of 1964? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. Due to his rousing speeches, Martin Luther King was seen as a spokesman for the civil rights movement of the 60s, and he was great television. Previously, we've reflected on his youth and schooling, then the Montgomery bus boycott, where Martin Luther King first gained national prominence due to media attention. Next, he participated in the lunch counter and Freedom Rider protests, and then pursued civil rights in Albany, Georgia. Now, Albany did not attract overwhelming media attention, but the brutality and bombing in Birmingham, where children were martyred, did bolster public support for the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. What was in living memory for all Americans of voting age during the civil rights struggle of the 60s, during the presidencies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson? Everyone remembered the end of World War II, which meant that the Nazi regime of Hitler had been defeated less than 2 decades previous. In addition to the civil rights struggle, what other event was happening that was also unimaginable without the experiences of the Great War? The other struggle that dominated the news was the Second Vatican Council that was in session from 1962 through 1965, under first Pope John XXIII and then Pope Paul VI. 2 issues that dominated the sessions were rejecting anti-Semitism and the American-dominated debate about religious freedom, which also implied the embrace of democracy and the rejection of both fascist and communist authoritarianism. Anti-Semitism dominated Europe's attention as much as civil rights was the center of attention in America, not only in Nazi Germany, but also in France and Italy. Now, our author, David Levering Lewis, compared the upcoming March on Washington to the black leader Philip Randolph's threat to stage a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. at the start of World War II, which was called off when FDR ensured that more blacks would be employed in the wartime factories. Indeed, Philip Randolph suggested to Martin Luther King that he plan his March on Washington as a repeat of his planned march many decades before. But the March on Washington was also a replay of the Marion Anderson concert in 1939. She was a black opera singer who was denied use of concert halls in Washington, D.C. for her concerts. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to sing for the public facing the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Both gave blacks hope that better times were ahead for their race. Now, during this time, Martin Luther King closed the speech. I say good night to you by quoting the words of an old Negro slave. We ain't what we ought to be, and we ain't what we want to be, but thank God we ain't what we was. And Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence as a tactic. It disarms your opponent, exposing his moral defenses. If he doesn't beat you, wonderful. If he beats you, you develop the quiet courage of accepting blows without retaliating. If he doesn't put you in jail, wonderful. But if he puts you in jail, you go in that jail and transform it from a dungeon of shame to a haven of freedom and unity. If a man hasn't discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. And Lewis writes in his biography, Philip Randolph formally proposed to the 5 major civil rights organizations that an army of black plaintiffs be sent to Washington to demand the enactment of fair employment legislation and the passage of an increased minimum wage, extending it to agriculture. Though some of these organizations were not initially enthusiastic, the March on Washington picked up steam when Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill was endangered due to a threatened filibuster in the Senate. When John F. Kennedy worried that the protests might degenerate into violence, Philip Randolph simply replied, "The Negroes are already in the streets. It is very likely impossible to get them off. If they are bound to be in the streets in any case, Is it not better that they be led by organizations dedicated to civil rights and disciplined by struggle, rather than to leave them to other leaders who care neither about civil rights nor nonviolence? In the summer of 1963, the heads of many civil rights organizations met in New York, including Martin Luther King of SCLC, John Lewis of SNCC, and also the leaders of NAACP, CORE, and the Urban League. Also attending were Jewish rabbis, Protestant and Catholic clergy, and Walter Reuther of the UAW, or United Auto Workers. The organizers and the Park Service were anticipating 150,000 participants, but about 250,000 attended. About a third were white. Entertainment was planned for the participants, including Joan Baez, John Dillon, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and many others, which helped guarantee that this would be a peaceful gathering. The march leaders met with members of Congress that morning and met with President Kennedy after the event. 10 speakers from civil rights organizations were planned, and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream was the last speech. The speakers were careful not to criticize President Kennedy, but they did soften up John Lewis's speech, which initially threatened that the next time we won't march on Washington, but we will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way General Sherman did on his march through Georgia, where he burned, pillaged, and destroyed the countryside. Instead, Lewis changed this to say that we would march through the South, through the streets of Danville and Cambridge and Birmingham, but we will march with the spirit of love and dignity that we have shown here today. In his speech, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP suggested that the pending Civil Rights Bill and other legislation should include desegregated public transportation, including buses, integrated education, voting rights for blacks, and better housing, Fair Employment Practices Act to bar federal, state, city, and private employers, unions, and contractors from job discrimination, a minimum wage of not less than $2 an hour, which is equivalent to $19 an hour in 2022, federal programs to train and place unemployed workers, and better enable federal agencies to enforce these rights. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech begins. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. We have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. And King continues, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every America was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Martin Luther King is also using language reminiscent of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. No, although many white liberals were concerned that Martin Luther King was going too fast in his protests and demands, there were many activists more radical than he, including the student organization SNCC that he helped form, and militants like Malcolm X, whose supporters egged Martin's car when he was in Harlem. And his dream continues. There will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until a bright day of justice emerges. But there is something I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining a rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Martin Luther King reminds his audience of the need for nonviolent tactics. We must forever conduct our struggle with a high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, has come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. The destinies of blacks and whites are intertwined. Contrary to the lost cause mythology that reinterpreted the history of the Civil War in favor of the Southern cause, the Negro really did play a central role in American history. Freed slaves like Frederick Douglass helped lead the abolitionist movement before the Civil War, and W.E.B. Du Bois, in his groundbreaking history, Black Reconstruction, demonstrated that blacks helped bring victory to Union forces during the Civil War by providing valuable intelligence and weakening the Southern economy when many slaves escaped during the war. Black soldiers enlisted in the Union Army in large numbers, assuring its victory, and blacks were leaders in the Reconstruction governments after the Civil War until Reconstruction was ended, and white supremacists disenfranchised black voters, passing Jim Crow segregation laws. W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction became the dominant historical narrative, interpreting the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction as a result of the civil rights struggles of the 60s. But Martin Luther King also emphasizes that civil rights activists should never give up and should never waver in their dedication. They have come to realize that their freedom is inexorably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we must always march ahead. We cannot turn back. And the dream continues. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? And the answer is, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. Before the civil rights era of the 60s, when blacks traveled, most hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and other establishments refused to cater to blacks. There was a national publication, the Green Book, that listed those establishments that welcomed blacks. This was necessary because there were tens of thousands sundown towns across the United States that did not welcome blacks after dark, and this was enforced by the police. When will blacks be satisfied? Martin Luther King proclaims, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their own dignity by signs stating, for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. And Martin Luther King reminds us listeners that unjust laws must be challenged, that the freedoms of speech and assembly implies a freedom to protest, a freedom that had been recently confirmed by the Supreme Court during the Birmingham struggle. The dream continues. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friends. Some have claimed that Martin Luther King went off script in his I Have a Dream refrains, but he had been trying out this refrain in previous speeches. Other speeches listed the demands of the movement, but Martin instead chose to inspire with his speech, and this is indeed one of the most memorable speeches in modern history. The refrains begin with phrases from the Gettysburg Address. Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day in the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering in the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. More blood would be drawn in Mississippi, as the local police, in league with the KKK, would murder both black and white students who were registering voters in Mississippi. And Martin Luther King proclaims, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right down in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Blood had already been drawn in Alabama, including the death by dynamite of 4 young black girls attending Sunday school in a black church. The dream continues. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And Martin Luther King concludes his dream. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. What is ironic is that on the face of Stone Mountain, the most visited tourist attraction in Georgia, were carved the portraits of Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Confederate Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. This is a pilgrimage site for white supremacists and members of the Ku Klux Klan. Stone Mountain Park is owned by the state of Georgia. An important Civil War battle was won by Grant's Union Army when they drove the Confederates off Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. Martin Luther King finishes this dream. When this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, and we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And what were the reactions to the I Have a Dream speech? After every speech, the news commentators always remarked that it did not move the needle of public opinion. What this impatience misses is that politics is like relationships. Over a long period of time, they will either improve or they will deteriorate. We should always seek that they improve. As Hubert Humphrey noted after the speech, all this probably hasn't changed any votes on the Civil Rights Bill, but it is a good thing for Washington and the nation and the world. and people all around the world were also watching these events unfold on their television sets. John F. Kennedy issued this statement: "We have witnessed today in Washington tens of thousands of Americans, both Negro and white, exercising their right to assemble peacefully and direct the widest possible attention to a great national issue." A few months later, in November, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in his motorcade in Dallas, Texas, with his brain spilling out of his skull as it rested on the lap of the First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy. Martin Luther King wrote in Look magazine, "JFK at his death was undergoing a transformation from a hesitant leader to a strong figure with deeply appealing objectives." JFK's assassination, combined with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, accelerated the progress of civil rights legislation in Congress. Our biographer Lewis notes, Martin believed that cruel chance had devised the ultimate civil rights weapon, a presidential voice that spoke in a Southern drawl. Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, was a highly effective congressman, rising to become Senate Majority Leader before he was chosen to be Vice President, and vigorously cajoled the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. As Lewis recounts, as 1963 drew to a close, the stature of Martin Luther King continued to grow. In January 1964, the calm, directed gaze of Martin Luther King graced the cover of Time magazine again. He had been chosen Man of the Year, the second black man since Emperor Haile Selassie to receive this honor. The Time magazine article was flattering. Few can explain the King mystique, yet he has an undescribable capacity for empathy that is the touchstone of leadership. By deed and by preaching, he has stirred in his people a Christian forbearance that nourishes hope and smothers injustice. In a speech in Europe in December 1964, Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes in America are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I am mindful that debilitating and grinding poverty afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder." After the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he faced more bloody struggles against white supremacists, first in St. Augustine, then in registering voters in Mississippi, then facing police dogs and brutality in his famous March on Selma, followed by his fight for more equitable housing in Chicago. Finally, his life was cut short by his assassination in Memphis. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. The author, David Levering Lewis, is planning to write a biography of Martin Luther King when he was assassinated. It was initially published 16 months later and quickly became the classic biography of this civil rights icon. We discussed this biography and several controversies that have since arisen in greater depth in our reflection on his youth and school years. We also recommend the Time magazine article for another readable biography of Martin Luther King. Lewis also wrote the definitive biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.